And this is Grover Norquist with Americans for Tax Reform. This is the Leave Us Alone podcast. And we're here with Senator Gramm of the great state of Texas, Congressman and then Senator, played a pivotal role in getting the Reagan tax cuts passed, which have been the model for every Republican president who comes in since. Senator, when I first moved to D.C. about 78, you were just coming in as a Democrat congressman. Could you give us a sense of what it was like to be, this is Jimmy Carter territory for you young people. Inflation was 10% a year, and that was considered natural, okay? Worse than Biden. And the economy was collapsing. The Soviet Union was eating up everything that wasn't nailed down. So we had a whole bunch of problems all at once. You come in as a Democrat, you join the budget committee. Could you play that out? Because 78 to 80, and then when you came back reelected in 80, you were central to Reagan getting the spending and the tax bills through. Because a lot of Americans don't know this story, and you can't understand Trump world if you don't understand this.
All right. By the time I came to Congress, we were 7 years into a 9.2% inflation rate. The economy was in deep trouble. And in the 1978 elections, people were beginning to run on the fact that there was a crisis in America and that something needed to be done about it. I got to Washington in 1979, and I started working with David Stockman, a Republican from Michigan, on a budget with the idea that we needed to put a bipartisan program together to try to bring spending under control. We offered a budget in 1980 called the Bipartisan Recovery Budget, and it got 159 votes. But it got enough Democrat votes that after the 80 elections, we had a majority in favor of a dramatic change in policy in Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives. Stockman became OMB director. Our budget became the Reagan budget. And I was the author of the Reagan program in the House. We were able to get 26 Democrat votes. On the critical vote, it passed by one vote. And then 8 people changed their votes, and the Reagan program became law. The tax cut was absolutely essential because in 1979, 1980, we had a tremendous burst of inflation, and we had a massive number of tax brackets, none of which were indexed. So the tax rate on the American people exploded in 1979 and 1980. And so the argument for the tax cut was not just to get the economy going, it's that the tax burden was so high at that point that we couldn't have anything like full employment because the tax burden had become so great that it was crippling the economy. And so we were able to sell the tax cut and the spending cuts. And of course, the rest is history. Program worked, the economy exploded, the inflation was stopped, Soviet Union collapsed. Good policy produces good results, not sometimes, but every time. And bad policy, unfortunately, as we know, produces bad results, not sometimes, but all the time.
That passed. Then in 86, there was one more effort to bring the tax rates down and a broadening of the base. It wasn't really a tax cut. It's a small tax cut, but it was designed to reduce rates. How did that play out?
Well, basically, the idea was that we were able to convince people on a bipartisan basis in the House and Senate, which tells you something about leadership, Grover. Ronald Reagan was able to convince Democrats in the House and Senate. He was able to convince people that we should reduce the number of deductions and credits and all the crap that was in the tax code and reduce rates. And we were able to do that and reduce the tax rate down to 28%, which was a dramatic change in policy and probably the best tax code that was ever adopted.
That would have been
in American
15 and 27, 28 individual and 34.
We ended up, then what happened is that when Bill Clinton was elected, he raised the marginal rate on high-income individuals, and then the compromise with Clinton when we were trying to break the impasse was to cut the capital gains tax rate to 15%, which we did. And of course, the economy responded to it.
Okay.
In fact, from the time that the Reagan program took hold in 1983 until 2000, we had basically a golden age of economic growth in America. We had very high growth rates, very low inflation rates. The economy boomed. Americans prospered.
You've done a study and written a book on how welfare spending in the United States is understated and the damage it does is not well understood. Could you walk us through that there's all this hundreds of billions of dollars spent, but it doesn't affect the poverty level? How does that happen?
Here's where
Everyone, listen to this, share it with your friends and relatives. I am frustrated that this wonderful book that the senator has written isn't on everybody's lap, but we're going to get you the quick summary.
I'm also frustrated, Grover, that I can't get the administration, the Trump administration, to force the census to count welfare program benefits as income to the people who get the benefits. So the Census Bureau does not count any tax change as income, and it doesn't count any benefit as income unless it's paid to you in cash or cash equivalent. So a refundable tax credit, and you get two of them if you qualify for poverty, not counted by the census as income. So when you see poverty income, when you see the poverty rate, it's not counting two checks from the Treasury as income to the people who got the check.
For child tax
Food
credit?
stamp, exactly, is not counted. Food stamps, housing subsidies, Medicaid, 90% of the benefits paid by government to people who qualify for the poverty program are not counted as income by the Census Bureau.
So when the New York Times tells us there are this many poor people under the poverty line, they are ignoring all food stamps and the cash sent and tax rebates for taxes that weren't paid in the first place.
Medicaid, and 100 other federal programs.
100. I didn't know there were.
100 other welfare programs provided by the federal government and all the programs provided by state and local government. So that at the federal level, we are spending about $77,000 per poverty household on welfare. $77,000 per household. That is enough income to put someone firmly in the middle class in America. And when they're saying that 12.5% of people are poor, actually it's about 1.5%. And those are people who have physical, mental, alcohol abuse, drug problems that are living in the streets, not applying for these programs.
Okay. I would understand why a left-wing Democrat would say, let's not tell anyone about how much money we're spending on welfare because we take it from working people and that might irritate them. I would presume if they expect to keep getting more money, they have to keep saying, there's so many poor people and that's so awful. We have to raise your taxes again to help all these poor people. And that's what these programs do. They help poor people. It says so right here on the label. I understand why the Democrats take that position and why Biden did and why Obama wouldn't want the Census Bureau or the Labor Department to keep these statistics. What is the reason you get when you talk to Trump administration people or maybe even Bush people before? Why don't they do that? Does that take a law?
Let me first say that this all goes back to 1947 and the way the Census Bureau calculated income then when there were virtually no welfare benefits that weren't paid in cash. Okay? But now the basic response is that up until we wrote this book, very few people in America understood what was happening. You've got probably a few people who specialized in this, most of whom had politics way to the left of us, knew it, but nobody else did. The purpose of the book was to blow the whistle on it, okay? Why hadn't the administration put out an executive order mandating that the Census Bureau simply count all cash payments through tax refunds and, in fact, taxes in general in calculating income and poverty? And why aren't they counting payments made in kind like food stamps and Medicaid? They could easily fix that with an executive order. Why aren't they doing it? Inertia. But also, I think now there's this feeling in the Republican Party that let's run on welfare fraud, but let's don't explain to people that the biggest welfare fraud is in Washington, D.C. We're not counting the value of the benefits in deciding who qualifies. If you counted the value of the benefits, you'd cut the number of people qualifying dramatically. Maybe they think that they can get those people to vote for them. We're not doing, under the old Reagan budget, we gave the Congress power, we gave government the power to garnish your wages on student loans. I did that. I'm proud of that. There were deadbeats in the Department of Education that had defaulted student loans. Now, the administration, the Trump administration, has backed off garnishing wages. Maybe they think by not doing that, those people are going to vote Republican in the upcoming primary. I doubt it. The Democrats, the last moment when they were in control, before the election, gave back the Social Security reform that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan did related to government employees. $1 trillion right out of Social Security. A theft right out of Social Security. And did it win them the election? No, they lost the election. Dowdy gave them a vote. Why we can't wise up to that fact, I don't know. They haven't done it. I wish they would do it. They could change the history of this country. If people knew that we were spending $77,000 for every, quote, poverty family in America, they would go berserk.
Well, what?
And like
at our HER.org, we will both share this podcast, but also show people how to get your book, where to get it. And
it's this book, The Myth of American Inequality, but a summary of it is in the newer book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. The last chapter in the book on poverty summarizes this whole thing. You can go on Google and buy the book cheap, and when you read this book, you'll understand our country's a lot greater than you think.
There seems to be, there's an awful lot we could do to reduce spending without, quote unquote, hurting poor people. And there's a lot of money going somewhere that isn't going to people that are technically poor. Is anyone in the administration, is there a senator or a congressman who sees and has learned what you know and is making this case legislatively or before Congress, somebody we could give our support to and say, we want to encourage you to push that legislation? Or
I've been trying to get a champion in Congress. Senator Cornyn has expressed interest in being a leader in this area. I don't know whether he's introduced a bill or not, but let me follow up on that. There are a couple of things you could do. One, ask the administration to require the Census Bureau to count taxes as income lost to the taxpayer and welfare benefits as gain resources for people who are in poverty. And that just simply requires an executive order. President's put out more than anybody since Franklin Roosevelt. And all it's got to do is issue an executive order that says that all tax credits and all welfare payments shall be counted as income to the recipients. It's not difficult, and nobody in the world can stand and look you in the face and say, you ought not to do that.
But as you just alluded, on the other end, people who work on Saturdays and earn a lot of money, they get heavily taxed. But if the government is to tell you how much money they have, they don't talk about the fact that the government takes a bunch of it away. Here's a rich person before taxes, and poor person before welfare benefits and tax.
The Census Bureau says the ratio of the top quintile, the top 20% of income recipients to the bottom 20% is 14.6 to 1, okay? But if you count all welfare benefits as income gained and you count all taxes as income lost, the ratio is 4 to 1, not 14.6 to 1. Okay? That's a pretty dramatic change. Now, you can say 4 to 1 is too much. Okay? But it's a completely different debate. And so all I want the administration to do is simply tell people, force the census to tell people the truth. I don't understand how that's in any way debatable. And Congress could, of course, mandate it. But look, Democrats are going to oppose that because what happens is about every 5 or 6 years, Congress, when it's got when it has a Democrat majority, says, look, there are 12.5% of people in America who are poor. We need to do something about it. We need to raise welfare benefits, and we raise them, but then we don't count them as income. So 6 or 7 years later, we come back and do it again. Okay? So we made them unpoor many times, and in the process, we put them right in the middle class. And so you want to know why people are unhappy in this country. They're unhappy because they're working, their spouse is working, and they're barely making ends meet, and right down the street in the same neighborhood, You've got people who are drawing welfare and not breaking a sweat. 40% of welfare recipients own their own home.
Say that one again.
40% of all welfare recipients own their own home.
Okay.
80% of the dwellings of poor people in America are air conditioned. I mean, those are census data.
Our friends in Europe, I've seen some comparisons that somebody on welfare in the United States compared to the middle income person in Europe has a bigger house, more floor space, a better TV, more likely a TV, heating and air conditioning as opposed to the European. I'm not sure. When I was in Mississippi, they were very proud of the following, that if Britain became a state, they would be the 51st poorest state after Mississippi. But that actually just changed so that now Britain would be is poorer per capita than Mississippi is. And in 3 years, Germany will be under Mississippi. One, Mississippi's growing. They cut taxes. They're doing well. They have right to work. They have school choice. But Europe is sinking. And that's just it's a rather dramatic number to see the difference between Europe and
And look, when you see these international comparisons, they're normally saying that poverty is below 1/3 of median income, and they show Americans having more poor people. But median income in America is upper middle income in Europe. And so if you work from the same base, there are far more people who are poor in Britain and in Germany than in the United States. Secondly, there's only one country in the world that transfers more of its income with transfer payments in the United States, and that's France. So, look, the real truth is, and you don't want to tell Bernie Sanders because then that's changed his personality, but it's as if Bernie Sanders went to bed and dreamed that America became a welfare state, and if he woke up today, his dream would have come true. Only he and nobody else knows it.
In your book, you talk about the 10 myths that Americans don't know or people aren't taught in school, they can't get from television on most channels. Could you go through a couple of the others? The one you just mentioned, that there's a lot more welfare money spent.
We do 7. So it's that people got poor during the Industrial Revolution, at the birth of capitalism. We call it the Genesis myth. The truth is, no people who ever lived on this earth saw their well-being, and I'm talking about workers, grow faster than during the Industrial Revolution. Changed the world, and is still changing the world. The second is progressive era regulation, that America benefited from this regulation. The truth is America lost in the regulation. Prices were higher, growth was slower, and in fact, Jimmy Carter, and I'm proud to say I voted for it, was the leader in repealing that regulation. It was not only, am I saying this, President Carter said it, the facts said it, and we repealed those regulations. Capitalism and greed caused a Great Depression. Government caused a Great Depression. And then there's what we could call the Trump myth, and that is that America's been hollowed out by trade in the post-war period, that we've lost our manufacturing capacity. The reality is we're producing more manufacturing goods today than we have ever produced in history. And the American worker in manufacturing is more productive. Now, the percentage of the labor force in manufacturing has declined, but it's declined in China. is declining all over the world, just as the number of people in agriculture went from 43% in 1900 to 1.5% today. Now, have we been hollowed out in terms of agriculture? We're feeding half the world. We've done it with technology. Now, my mama, who grew up in the country, dreamed of going back to the farm, but my mother always reminded her, you were starving to death on the farm. We all want to go back to the farm, but in reality, we're so much better off today. And then there is the financial crisis. That decline in regulation caused a financial crisis. There was no decline in regulation. Actually, there was more regulation when it occurred than 20 years before. And the financial crisis was caused by subprime lending that government mandated be made and mandated and basically encouraged banks to hold the financial. And then there's inequality, and then there's poverty. And inequality is grossly overstated by our figures. And also, these studies that have been done are all biased by the way they do the study. What has happened is the rich have gotten richer and everybody's gotten richer. And you take Bill Gates or you take Warren Buffett. Am I poor because they're rich? Bill Gates made me richer. He only owned, at the peak, he only owned 7% of his company. Retirees and pension funds own 75% of Microsoft. I own Microsoft. You own Microsoft. Nobody has a general retirement fund in this country that doesn't own Microsoft. So has he, by getting rich, made you poorer? No, he's made you richer. Elon Musk, I used to pay a fortune for a satellite, for wires all over my, so I could get internet. I live in the country, and I work. I have a young wife who wants money and would put me in a cheap nursing home if I quit working. I had to work. Elon Musk came out with a satellite that was 1/3 cheaper and at least twice as good as what I had. And he got rich doing it, but I got richer. And then it cut my expense and gave me better internet. Am I supposed to resent him? This is the kind of stuff Americans need to understand. Only in America, the only way you can get something for nothing is if you're the government or you're a crook. Through the honest system, you've got to provide value to get something. And we need more of that system and less of the latter.
Senator, thank you for that list of the 7, because I do hope people will get your book and share this video, because you summarized it nicely, but to be able to get those numbers, every Republican congressman and senators knew what you just outlined. They could face their audience, the press, the Democrat they debate running with so much more confidence. And we just need to be able to say no and punch them right in the nose back when they come up and want to reintroduce one of those lies. I thank you for focusing on the industrialization. And I remember people locked in from the rural areas into the cities because of the industrialization. People don't move to areas where they're poorer, okay? They move to areas with more opportunity. As I used to say to my left-wing friends, there's a reason why the Berlin Wall has its guns pointed in one direction and not the other. No one's trying to get into communist East Germany. They're leaving as a result. It's a real hint. Texas, that you represented as a congressman and a senator, is a very good model. At Americans for Tax Reform, we're working with all the states that are looking to follow the Texas model on the state income tax. There are 8 states with no income tax. personal income tax at the state level. There are 5 that in the last 4 years have passed laws that will take them automatically down to zero. As revenue comes in, instead of spending it, they will cut the income tax a little bit each year. That's Mississippi, that's Oklahoma, it is Indiana, it is West Virginia, and it is Kentucky, those 5. And this week, I'm going to Missouri, where the governor is announcing the campaign to go to zero in Missouri. Last week, I was in South Carolina, where they passed it in the House all the way to zero. The Senate says we're going to pass the same bill, not something like it that we have to tangle about for 3 months or 3 years, but the same bill to get it done. So that'll put South Carolina on path. North Carolina's already on path down to 2.4. Then they got to click it again, and it keeps going forward. But Texas, you've got a bunch of other states sneaking up behind you. Some other stuff.
I know. It means we need to do a better job. We need to spend less money. Look, letting people keep their own money not only enhances their freedom, but it ends up enriching the country. And Grover, you've done great work in your lifetime on this issue and deserve a lot of credit. I hope, we should be running in this upcoming election on welfare reform. We should tell the American people how big the fraud is. We should correct the fraud in Washington. We ought to run on the issue with mandatory work requirements for all welfare programs. Democrats could not support that program. And so if we were running on that issue, we could save the House and Senate. Running on all these other issues, we're going to end up losing the House, and we could end up losing the Senate. God
Those
forbid.
other issues are shiny things, and they sound so interesting for 25 minutes or even 2 weeks. But what you've outlined, that people are paying a lot more in taxes for a lot more welfare than they've ever been led to believe. They've been lied to about it. I think that's one of the things that would help win the election that you just...
No, I agree.
People hate to be lied
This whole idea of running on affordability, the Democrats drive up prices. And then we're stupid enough to debate them on whether we ought to have price controls and rent controls and more government subsidies. They cause the problem. And then and they've got all kinds of phony fixes that'll make it worse. And then we stupidly want to debate that and then imitate it. The president's call for usury limits on credit cards. You realize that ordinary people wouldn't be able to borrow money through their credit card. All that does is deny people credit. Then they got to go to their brother-in-law, and he charges them 120%. Yeah. And so we're going to out liberal the liberals. Nobody's going to buy a phony when they get the real thing. Yeah, well, listen, why not cut their rates and let them keep their own money themselves rather than letting the government?
I believe that before this year is out, the president will, through executive order, index capital gains for inflation. So we no longer pay capital gains on the inflation when you sell a house or stocks or bonds or a small business or a farm or gold. No taxing the inflation part on capital gains, which would be a tremendous drop in that tax and real growth. I know that I've talked to the president about it. He is he's interested. But it's one of those things where I'm not the last guy to talk to him, so we'll see.
No, I know. I'll tell you a little history. The last item that was added to the Reagan tax cut in 1981 was indexing. We were having a meeting, and I'd been pushing, other people had been pushing, to index the tax brackets, okay? Unfortunately, that was such a big step, we didn't talk about indexing capital gains, which it would have been great if we could have done both. But in any case, we had this meeting, and this Republican member had an amendment that would exempt from capital gains businesses, the appreciation of businesses that you gave to your employees. And so I'm 3 years out of being a college professor, and I'm sitting in this room in the White House. So I say, oh, wait a minute. You're going to make capital, you're going to let people, and they could do it tax-free. In other words, no death tax. You're going to let people give their life work to somebody else tax-free, but you're going to take 40% of their life's work they want to give to their children and grandchildren. What the hell are you people thinking about? And so I got a little emotional, so I got up, went out in the hall, and waited about 10 minutes to regain my composure because I realized it wasn't doing me any good. So when the meeting was over, Jim Baker came up to me and said, I don't really disagree with you on that amendment. We're just trying to get the votes. And he said, tell me again about the indexing the tax code. Now, I'm not saying he did it because I told him again, but it was the last item added. And God knows, look at the effect of indexing the tax code in 1981. That didn't go into effect till 85.
That was one of the most important parts of the Reagan tax bill. I had no idea it was last minute.
Parts of the tax bill. And it was the last minute, last item. So you never know when you're going to have an effect. Keep talking to the president.
Absolutely. We'll get, Secretary of Treasury is good on this. And the president was in his first term. So we'll hopefully get that moving through. Senator Gramm, thank you so very much. Thank you for your work as a Democrat when it must have been even more exciting to try and get things done. Thank you for joining the Republican Party and making the Republican Party the Gramm-Reagan tax-cutting, spending-limiting Republican Party. You and President Reagan have changed the direction that the country went into, and thank you.